Have you ever made something that you were genuinely proud of? Something you poured countless time and effort into completing? I asked this very same question 6 months ago when I built the Obi-Wan Kenobi series Darth Vader helmet. I was content, prideful even, but the universe works in mysterious ways, and its timing can oftentimes be cruel. 10 days after completing that helmet, everything changed. Levy 3D, the creator of the helmet, released a massive update for the model, which, at the risk of sounding dramatic, was nothing short of revolutionary. Improvements were made to the proportions, making the model more screen accurate than it already was. It's the features, however, that justify this video being made in the first place. The model now includes an optional neck piece with interior details which closely resemble the screen-used FBFX helmet. For those unaware, FBFX are a UK-based special effects and costume-making team who were tasked with creating their own unique version of Darth Vader's suit, specifically for the Kenobi series. The model now also features an interior head cradle system, as well as a magnetic top cradle system, which allows for easy assembly and disassembly, all of which utilizing a combination of M4 screws, threaded heat inserts, and magnets to secure into place. Since my original OWK video, released only 6 months ago, I decided to structure this video slightly different than I otherwise would. This video will serve more as a sequel, a spiritual successor if you will. Because the first video was a complete, thorough overview of the build process, I would highly recommend you watch that video first for context. This video will focus more on the features that are new, as well as the techniques and materials that have since changed. As always, links to the model itself, as well as the materials used, will be in the description. This build started out the same way they always do, with a lot of printing. I'll admit, the new cradle system, as well as the required hardware, were very overwhelming at first glance. Levy has since added slightly modified versions of certain parts, which gives you some flexibility and agency in how you wish to print and assemble the helmet. Prior to printing, I chose to fuse the top cradle system and the face of the helmet together in my slicer. I did this in order to reduce the amount of M4 screws and heat inserts needed. Because the inside of the dome won't ever be visible, I printed the version that only includes the standoffs, which hold the 12x3mm magnets. As for the interior head cradle system, by default, the cradle itself is separate from the claw, which mounts on top of the cradle and connects the entire assembly inside the helmet. Just like I did earlier with the face and its top cradle, I pre-assembled these two parts in Slicer to reduce hardware cost and make the assembly easier for myself. The modifications I made to the files prior to printing meant there was only one phase of the install where I would need to use the M4 screws and heat inserts this build called for, that being the mounting of the inner head cradle assembly inside the helmet. The M4 screws are installed from within, while the heat inserts are installed on the outside of the face into their corresponding holes. Installing the heat inserts were a tricky balance. They obviously need to go in straight, otherwise the screws wouldn't catch. The shape of the helmet made it difficult to gauge at times. Needless to say, it took some trial and error. The technique which worked best for me was to simply run the screw entirely through its designated slot, enough to where I can thread the heat insert from the outside. Using a soldering iron, I applied heat to the top of the heat insert, while simultaneously and slowly unscrewing the screw from within, applying downward pressure with my soldering iron the entire time. Doing it this way allowed me to ensure the heat insert would sync with proper alignment to the screw. My first attempts at making the detailed neck piece were the closest thing to hell I have ever experienced. At the time of this build, I didn't own a resin printer big enough to print this entire part, so I split it in half and glued the two parts together using 5-minute epoxy. Moving on. After installing the magnets into their respective slots, it's here when I realized the true error of my ways. The weight. For those who don't know, resin 3D prints in their natural form are entirely solid and weigh a ton. Admittedly, this was something I was aware of on my first go, I just overestimated the strength of the magnets I was using. It's common practice when resin printing to hollow out the model, which reduces the suction force, saves resin, and most importantly, reduces the weight. The catch is that you need to manually add drainage holes for the excess resin to escape, which for some models is no big deal, but in this particular situation, it was tricky, and I had to get a bit creative where I added the drainage holes. The hollow neck piece weighed significantly less and seemed promising for the time being. On the second attempt, I tried something new and installed the magnets first, attaching each half to their corresponding sides. I did this to make the alignment and fusing of these two parts a bit easier for myself. For a moment, everything worked. What you're seeing now is proof of this. For reasons I still don't understand, the entire system failed overnight. The resin-printed neck no longer aligned properly with the face, and the magnets no longer held the pieces together. I was completely stumped, and fed up if I'm being honest. There were too many variables with the resin-printed neck, so it was at this point when I decided to toss it and cut my losses. I instead printed the piece in PLA, which automatically meant I'd take a hit in quality, not to mention the extra post-processing I would now need to do, which at this point was fine by me if it meant I would finally move forward with the build. A total of 13 hours were spent sanding this helmet in preparation for paint. I recently picked up some interface sanding pads, which have been a huge quality of life improvement when it comes to sanding curved surfaces. I would highly recommend you pick these up if you don't own them already. My process is more or less the same as always. I used UV resin primarily for gap filling and relied on filler primer for the rest. The only new change that was made to my process was the use of a new type of filler primer. I stumbled across Seymour filler primer when I was restocking on supplies. Cans of filler primer go by fast, so the 15-ounce can they were offering, while a bit pricey, seemed like a good investment. This primer is also lacquer-based, which means the dry times are significantly faster than what I normally use. I'm accustomed to spraying rather heavy coats when using filler primer. I noticed immediately that the Seymour primer runs fairly easily, so lighter coats are definitely recommended. This primer worked great for me at first. However, in terms of the sanding process, around the 80% point of completion, the primer started to crack across all three pieces. I had to do a lot of sanding in order to stop the cracks from resurfacing, and I lost a lot of time dealing with this issue. I've since used the Seymour primer on several different projects as of late. Unfortunately, I still experience the issues with cracking. Sometimes it's best to just stick with what you know and what works best for you. I've never had any issues with Duplicolor primer, so I'll continue to use it moving forward. As a prop maker, I think my greatest strength is also my greatest weakness. I'm not afraid whatsoever to try new ideas, no matter how blatantly stupid or impractical they may seem. In my experience, things usually work out great, or I face the consequences of my actions. There's usually no in-between. When it came time to paint the helmet, I had an idea I've been meaning to test for quite some time, and figured this was the perfect time to do so. I wondered if decanting a can of spray paint and applying it through an HVLP touch-up gun would yield a noticeably higher quality finish. There are many different ways to go about doing this. I chose to puncture a small hole at the top of the can, then waited for the propellant to exit the can. I then carved something of a pour spout towards the top, and poured the paint from the can into a separate container. I left the container uncapped for several days, periodically stirring, that way the remaining propellant within the paint is able to escape. My first attempt at this was a catastrophe. I incorrectly judged where the paint line was, and when I punctured the can, I was met with consequences. You can't fix stupid. Luckily, I was wearing eye protection, as well as a respirator, but I should have known better. Gloves, long sleeves, and doing this in a safer environment should have been accounted for the first time. I used a HVLP touch-up gun that I picked up from Harbor Freight with a 0.6mm nozzle. The experience and results overall were extremely poor. The paint was textured and pebbling on the surface. I think there were a few factors at play which led to this. Spraying too far at too low of an air pressure is definitely a possibility. I didn't add any type of leveling thinner or flow improver, which could also explain the poor quality. Lastly, I failed to notice this at the time, but my spray gun was actually damaged and wasn't operating at its full capacity. The trigger was slightly bent and twisted, and wasn't able to be fully pressed. The trigger no longer released naturally into its normal resting state as well. It's unclear what effect, if any, this defect had on the quality, but it's safe to assume that all of these factors combined were responsible. Fixing this was fairly straightforward. I wet sanded each part to remove the texture, then repainted the entire helmet, this time with a normal spray can. The next step was applying a 2K ClearCoat. I've learned a lot these past 6 months. I now use a different spray gun, one that's far more compatible with my current air compressor. I switched over to a disposable paint cup system, which has been a huge quality of life improvement as far as cleaning goes. In terms of safety, I now use a Hobby Air branded supplied air system, which delivers a constant supply of fresh air that's far removed from where I'm painting directly into my mask. I also just took some time and experimented with different gun settings and spraying techniques on test prints and other projects. The adjustments I've since made to my gun settings have drastically reduced the amount of overspray that's created, as well as reduced the amount of material that's used during any given paint application. The gun I'm now using is the AeroPro R500. It's a budget-friendly, low-volume, low-pressure spray gun that's less than $100 on Amazon. What drew me towards it was its very low air consumption. This gun only consumes 3 CFM, which most budget-friendly air compressors are capable of outputting. You don't need a large industrial-size air compressor to run a gun like this, especially when painting things like 3D printed helmets. I've been thinking about making an in-depth, dedicated video solely to this topic. I don't know much, and I have a lifetime of learning left ahead of me, but if you're interested in using these products in the context of painting 3D prints, and find yourself overwhelmed as to where to start, let me know in the comments if that type of video is of interest to you. I did end up getting a pretty significant run on the neck piece. I sanded it down with 1000 grit sandpaper, making absolutely certain the surface was completely smooth before moving any further. Menzerna compound and polish were then used to correct the paint job. More on this later. I could probably dedicate an entire video talking about the gunmetal paint that was used on this version of the suit. If I've learned anything about OWK gunmetal, it's an enigma. I found it difficult to get a solid read on its properties in the months spent analyzing it. Its properties seem to vary in appearance across different environments and lighting conditions. Those properties consistently appearing in the form of a darker, glossy-looking neck section, while the gunmetal facets on the face seem to alternate between a more matte metallic finish to a semi-gloss metallic finish. It's tricky, and it really depends on the lighting and which image you're looking at. My previous OWK build was a collaborative effort with 19 props. We both conducted our own research and testing, shared our findings with one another, and ultimately ended up with similar enough looking results despite using different methods. Our main source of reference was the behind-the-scenes showcasing of the suit in Adam Savage's tested video. Our interpretation then was that the paint overall favored on the side of a matte gunmetal finish, which heavily influenced the methods and products we both used. The result of which was us crafting helmets with gunmetal that was way too matte, lacking the metallic semi-gloss look we would soon be searching for. Our latest findings were more open-minded in approach. We realized there was a possibility we've been going about it all wrong. only focusing on one side of the coin when there was another side left undiscovered, therefore sparking another descent into madness in search of a new paint. All of the credit for the new paint that was used goes to 19 Props. It was discovered and tested by him, and he was kind enough to send me a bottle as a gift to be used on this very helmet. That paint being A-Stand Magnesium, which is a lacquer-based airbrush paint. The overall color of this paint remains fairly consistent with the products and techniques used before. Early testing seemed promising. This paint seemingly was capable of mimicking the properties of OWK gunmetal that we were looking for. As we soon learned, however, painting a spoon and painting a full-scale helmet are two very different things. This has to be one of the strangest paints I have ever used. During my first application, I applied it the same way I would any other metallic airbrush paint. 15 to 20 psi, shooting for nice even coverage. On my first attempt, the paint almost immediately became flaky, with almost fuzzy looking flakes appearing in real time directly in the areas I was actively painting. This is normal, to a degree, for lacquer-based metallic paints. All-clad chrome, for example. It's common after painting for residual metallic flakes to be resting on the surface, which can then be buffed afterwards with a microfiber cloth. The level of flakiness I was experiencing when using magnesium, however, was far more severe by comparison. In the end, I applied way too much paint, with blotchy, uneven coverage, and too bright of a color that has little to no metallic or reflective properties. I knew right away I would need to start over with a different strategy. The instructions for A-Stand paints are quite strange by comparison to that of All-Clad. Now, supposedly, A-Stand and All-Clad are one and the same, with A-Stand being a UK-based rebrand of All-Clad. Be that as it may, the issues I've experienced with A-Stand Magnesium are issues I have never experienced with All-Clad branded paints. A-Stand recommends one single medium coat, with an air pressure of 10 to 15 psi, which is a pretty challenging feat to pull off with an airbrush given the scale of what I was working with. I had assumed my first application went off the rails as a result of my straying from the instructions, so I tried again with those instructions now in mind, this time with a lower air pressure and closer spray distance, aiming for much lighter coats. I also switched over to a different airbrush, one with a 0.7mm tip for larger coverage. Despite the difference in technique, I still experienced issues with flaking mid-application, which made it very difficult to gauge my progress. I came to a realization that this paint, in my specific use case, needs to be treated more as a tint than an actual paint. When using something like a tint, you repeatedly apply light coats, gradually building up a certain color to your preferred shade. Since it was possible to apply too much paint, as I did in my first application, that meant the latter was also true. Translation, I was in for a rough time. In the months that have since passed, I've made another OWK helmet, with the same magnesium paint being showcased here. Only this time, I painted the helmet using an HVLP setup, which did prove to be a much more effective way of applying the paint as far as coverage is concerned, but the issues with flakiness were still present. Availability is a concern as well. At the time of recording, this paint is currently out of stock, and has been out of stock for several weeks on the Spray Gunner website. From what I was able to find, there aren't many other retailers who carry the specific color. The ones that do charge considerably more for shipping, which brings the total cost closer to $20, even more in some cases. There's a whole world of paints out there to be discovered. For that reason, I don't see why you should settle for a particular paint with a laundry list of issues. Magnesium is simply too temperamental to justify its use moving forward. While this paint was an improvement in direct comparison to my previous OWK helmet, I believe there's a paint out there which offers a similar, if not better finish, with a much easier application process. The search for new and improved gunmetal is never ending. Further testing will be done in the near future. When that new paint is found, I'll be sure to post about it on my Instagram. Feel free to follow me on there. I plan to try and post more often, showcasing projects that don't get standalone videos, as well as other noteworthy changes to my build process. It's been 48 hours since the dome was clear-coated. To those of you familiar with my videos, not much has changed in the post-processing that's done after the clear coat. Surface debris, runs, orange peel, Shit happens when you clear coat, but it's not the end of the world. In my case, the dome had some orange peel and surface debris that I wanted to remove. I did a thorough pass of wet sanding, starting with 1000 grit sandpaper and ending with 3000 grit sandpaper. I like to add a little bit of dish soap to my spray bottle, which helps the sandpaper glide a little more smoothly across the surface. As always, be extremely mindful when doing this and try to avoid sharp edges, especially with lower grits of sandpaper. After the wet sanding is complete, I use Menzerna's 400 Heavy Cut Compound, as well as their 3800 polish, to restore the gloss and remove the finer scratches caused by wet sanding. One new change that's been made to my polishing process is the use of a sealer to help protect the finish from UV, heat, and chemicals. A sealer is similar to a wax in purpose, only a sealer is comprised of synthetic polymers that chemically bond to the paint, offering a much more durable and longer-lasting protection. Car wax is comprised of natural ingredients that offer short-term protection ranging in weeks, whereas sealers offer several months of protection. This has been an overlooked aspect of my work for quite some time. A 2K ClearCoat has environmental protection in its uppermost layers. Since my process normally involves a lot of wet sanding and paint correction, I'm removing those protective layers from the ClearCoat in doing so, leaving my finish unprotected. The sealer I now use is also from Menzerna, that being their blue Power Lock sealer. I apply it with a foam applicator pad, then leave the excess product on the helmet for around 30 minutes. After that time, I buff and remove the excess material with a microfiber towel. If needed, you can apply an additional layer of sealer, but it's recommended to wait at least 4 hours before doing so. It's now time for the part of this build that was the most fun to work on, the detailed interior neck piece. I knew going in that the vast majority of these details would need to be painted by hand, but I made sure to use an airbrush whenever possible. When it came to these curved, ribbed wire housing components, I used a darker shade of Vallejo blue and neutral gray to mix this color. For these two components, which I can only assume function as some sort of voice amplifier, I wanted them to have more of a polished aluminum type finish. I first primed them with All-Clad's Gloss Black, then followed up with All-Clad Chrome. Light coats will result in a finish that's a darker, more reflective chrome. If you keep pushing the color, however, the finish will transition into a more silver, aluminum type look, which is what I was going for. The color of your base coat can greatly impact the finish as well. Had I used a gray base instead of black for these pieces, the end result may have been better. Next, I began work on these thick red and blue wire sections. I based them both with Vallejo red, then ran thin masking tape along the two innermost wires. I then went over everything with a Vallejo dark blue. I continued on, painting any remaining accent pieces silver. Things did look a bit messy at this stage, so I did go in afterwards and clean things up by removing any overspray that's present in some areas. Next, I began work on this smaller harmonica piece, which I was able to print separately in resin. Before I could paint and install it, I had to first cut out and install the metal chin mesh. The harmonica piece will later be inserted and rest directly on top of the mesh. Right before I started painting this piece, I realized a pretty big oversight on my part. When hollowing out the model, I did what I felt was sensible and placed the drainage holes on the underside of the model. I failed to realize these holes would be visible when looking through the metal chin mesh on the other side. The holes were rather big, and at this stage in the build, I didn't feel like going through the trouble of filling them or reprinting a new piece. After a short moment of contemplation, I looked to my surroundings for answers. I decided to use a piece of 320 grit sandpaper to act as a sort of backing. I traced a rough outline of the harmonica on the backside of the sandpaper. I then cut out the shape and glued it to the underside of the harmonica. Now ready for paint, I based the entire piece with All-Clad's Gloss Black to emphasize the metallic paints I would later use. Once dry, I went over the circular vent areas with Vallejo gunmetal, applying it by hand. The next step was a bit tedious and nerve-wracking at times. These outermost pipes had to be painted by hand and required several coats of the aluminum color I was using. Throughout the entire process, I'm being sure to use different types of metallic paints on each section, remaining somewhat faithful to what's seen on the FBFX prop. Moving on, I began work on this bottom plate of the harmonica. References show this being an off-black looking color. I've owned a black-gray color by Vallejo for quite some time that I've never had a chance to use yet, which I thought would work well in this case. This paint ended up reading a little blue, which I took issue with at first, but I came around to it eventually and decided to roll with it. The fully painted and now installed harmonica is what really started to bring this piece to life. I decided to go an extra step further and added some practical wires to add even more depth and realism to it. I did my best to match the wire sizes to what was seen in the reference photos. This proved to be one of the more challenging aspects of the neck piece as a whole. For starters, I had a hard time getting the wires to remain in place and maintain the bends and shapes I emplaced upon them. Even with the use of superglue and a spray activator, the wires were stubborn and would very easily fall out of position. A word of advice to anyone who plans on making this, I would recommend pre-planning the wire installation and add small holes into the model each place a wire will be. Another thing I failed to consider were the effects of using the activator spray. At this point, I didn't seal any of the paint work I've done up until this point. The activator spray reacted poorly with the paint, which ironically ended up working in my favor. Some metallic areas now appeared slightly darker, and the bottom plate of the harmonica piece, that originally read as too much of a blue color, was darkened and toned down by result of using the spray activator, which gave the entire piece a sort of unintentional weathering. In times like these, it's best not to question these things. I decided to trust the process and continued onward. The biggest hurdle I soon faced was direction. The 3D printed piece I had in front of me, while incredibly detailed, wasn't a perfect one-to-one recreation of the official prop. It very quickly became impossible to gauge where each and every wire started from and ended. There were wires and details present in the reference images that didn't exist or line up with the version I was working on. I had no choice but to go off script and take some creative liberty. It was a lot of improvising, finding natural places to tuck wires into and run wires out of. I did the best I could, and kept going until the number of wires I had added matched the amount visible in the references. It's been a dream of mine that one day a Vader helmet with these features and interior details would one day exist for me to make. Is mine perfect? Of course not. Are there mistakes? You can bet your life there are. Nevertheless, the experience of building this helmet has been a dream come true for me. As true as that may be, I believe it is possible to have too much of a good thing. This is now the third, technically fourth, OWK helmet I've made in recent months. As much as I love this character, When you make the same thing over and over again, it becomes increasingly difficult to keep the process new and exciting. Vader helmets in particular call for a level of precision that can take a toll on you if you're not careful. I've reached a point where I have little to no desire to make another Vader helmet of any variety until I have enough new things to experiment with. New paints, new products, new techniques, etc. Rest assured, this won't be the last Vader helmet I make, not by a long shot. I have no idea what this new year will bring, or what projects I'll take on. The unknown can be frightening, but I look forward to sharing whatever comes next with those of you watching. In that, I find comfort, and these days, comfort is in short supply. As always, thank you for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time.